Thaddeus Mercer stood in knee-deep snow, carving a trench around his cabin, while his neighbors watched from warm doorways and shook their heads. They packed snow against their cabins for insulation, the way it had always been done, and they thought Thaddeus had lost his mind to grief after burying his wife that spring. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this one stay with you. Hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale might be the most unbelievable one yet. The winter of 1851 came early to the valley. Snow arrived in mid-October, weeks before most settlers expected it, and by November, the entire basin was buried under drifts that reached past a man's waist in places. The valley held 11 families that year, scattered along a creek that ran south through pine forest and meadowland in what would later become western Montana territory. Most had arrived within the past 3 years, drawn by timber, trapping, and the promise of land that cost nothing but the labor to clear and claim it. Thaddeus Mercer and his wife Prudence had built their cabin in the spring of 1850. It sat on a slight rise above the creek, positioned to catch southern sun and avoid the worst of the spring flooding. The cabin was typical of frontier construction. Logs cut from nearby pine, notched at the corners, chinked with moss and clay. A single room, 16 feet by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace Thaddeus had built in one corner, a sleeping loft accessible by ladder, and 2 small windows covered with oiled paper that let in dim light but kept out most of the wind. They had a door made from split planks hung on leather hinges that fit well enough to block the larger drafts. It had taken them most of that first summer to build. Thaddeus was a careful man, methodical in his work. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, learned carpentry from his father who built furniture, and though he had no formal education, he understood how joints fit together and how wood behaved across seasons. Prudence came from a Quaker family in Ohio, and she brought to their partnership a practical intelligence and a refusal to complain about hardship that Thaddeus valued more than he could say. Their first winter in the cabin had been manageable. Cold, certainly, but they kept a fire going most hours, and the cabin stayed warm enough. When the heavy snows came in December of that first year, Thaddeus did what the other settlers did. He banked snow against the cabin walls, packing it tight from ground to window level, creating a barrier that everyone agreed helped keep the warmth inside. Ezekiel Gage, who had been in the valley longest, told him it was the smartest thing a man could do before deep winter set in. Snow was insulation, Ezekiel said, nature's gift to those wise enough to use it. So when the snows came in October of 1851, Thaddeus banked them against his cabin walls just as he had the previous year. He and Prudence laid in their supplies: salted meat, flour, beans, dried apples, coffee, firewood stacked against the north wall under a canvas tarp, coal oil for the lamps. They were as prepared as any family in the valley, and when the first serious cold arrived in early November, they settled in to wait out the winter together. Prudence's cough started in late November. At first it seemed like nothing, a minor irritation that would pass. But as December deepened and the cold settled into the valley with the weight of something permanent, the cough persisted. Then it worsened. She would wake in the night, chest tight, struggling to draw full breath. Thaddeus made her tea from pine needles and honey. He kept the fire burning hotter, piling on wood, until the cabin grew almost uncomfortably warm. Nothing helped. By early January, Prudence spent most of her time in bed in the loft, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her breathing had become labored, a wet, rattling sound that terrified Thaddeus more than he wanted to admit. He noticed things about the cabin he had never paid attention to before. The walls, despite the roaring fire, were damp to the touch. Condensation formed on the interior logs, especially near the corners and around the windows. Water would bead up and run down in thin streams, pooling on the floor. The smell of mold had begun to permeate everything, a musty odor that clung to their clothes and bedding. He tried to understand why the cabin stayed so damp. Outside he could see where the banked snow met the logs. Ice had formed there, thick sheets of it that gleamed in the winter sun. The snow he had packed so carefully against the walls had melted where it touched the warm logs, then refrozen into solid ice. He touched the logs on the exterior and found them wet beneath the ice, the wood dark with moisture. Inside those same sections of wall were the dampest, the coldest to the touch despite the fire burning constantly just feet away. Prudence died on the 23rd of February, 1852. Thaddeus was holding her hand when her breathing finally stopped. The cough had gotten so bad in the final week that she could barely speak, could barely take in enough air to sustain life. He sat with her body for hours, unable to move, unable to think beyond the simple fact that she was gone. He buried her 3 days later on the hillside above the cabin, in ground he had to thaw with fire before he could dig. Leander Polk and Silas Whitmore came to help, and their wives brought food that Thaddeus could not eat. They spoke the expected words about God's will and the hardness of frontier life and how winter took people sometimes, especially women who were not built for this kind of cold. Thaddeus thanked them and returned to his empty cabin alone. In the weeks that followed, he could not bring himself to leave. He sat by the fire and stared at the walls, at the moisture that continued to bead and run at the dark stains spreading through the chinking. He began to notice patterns. The dampness was worst where the exterior ice was thickest. The mold grew fastest in the corners where two wet walls met. The smell was strongest near the floor, where moisture pooled and never fully dried. He thought about Prudence's cough, about the wet rattle in her lungs, about how she had spent months breathing air thick with dampness and mold spores. And he began to wonder if the thing that killed her was not the cold, but the cabin itself. March brought the first thaw, and with it a revelation that changed everything Thaddeus understood about survival. As temperatures rose above freezing during the day, the ice that had formed against his cabin walls began to melt. Water ran down the exterior logs in streams, pooling at the foundation, soaking into the wood at every joint and crack. Inside, the walls wept with moisture. The floor near the exterior walls turned soft, the wood swelling with water it had absorbed through months of constant dampness. Thaddeus spent days studying the damage. He pulled apart sections of chinking and found it dissolved into mud. The moss rotted through, offering no seal at all. He examined the logs themselves and found them dark with rot in places, the wood soft enough to dig into with his thumbnail. The cabin was less than 2 years old, and already it was deteriorating in ways that would require serious repair before next winter. He began visiting the other cabins in the valley, ostensibly to check on neighbors, but really to observe. Everywhere he went, he saw the same pattern: thick ice where snow met cabin walls, interior dampness, dark stains on walls, the smell of mold. At Leander Polk's cabin, the condensation was so bad that water literally dripped from the ceiling logs. Temperance Polk had hung canvas sheets to catch the drips, and she emptied buckets twice a day. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had developed a cough that would not go away. Thaddeus said nothing, but the observation sat in his chest like a stone. At Ezekiel Gage's place, he finally asked the question directly. Why did they bank snow against the cabins if it created so much moisture and ice? Ezekiel looked at him as if he had asked why the sun rose in the east. Because snow is insulation, he said. Because it keeps the wind off the walls. Because it is what you do before winter, what his father had done, what every man who lived through hard cold had always done. The moisture was just part of winter, Ezekiel said. Cabins were damp. That was normal. You lived with it. But Thaddeus could not accept that answer. He had read books, not many, but enough to understand basic principles of heat and moisture. He knew that warm air held more moisture than cold air. He knew that when warm, moist air touched a cold surface, the moisture condensed into water. The interior of the cabin was warm and humid from cooking, from breathing, from the fire. The exterior walls, cooled by the ice pressed against them from outside, were cold. The warm interior air hit those cold walls and condensed, just as breath condensed into fog on a winter morning. The snow banking was not helping. It was creating the exact conditions that made cabins cold and damp and deadly. He spent weeks thinking through the problem, pacing his empty cabin, staring at walls that had killed his wife as surely as any disease. The standard method was wrong. Everyone did it. Everyone believed in it, but it was wrong. The snow melted against the warm logs. The meltwater became ice. The ice conducted heat away from the cabin far faster than dry wood ever could. The wet logs lost their insulating properties. The cold walls created condensation inside. The condensation created mold. The mold made people sick. Prudence had not died from cold. She had died from breathing poisoned air in a damp box that never dried out. Spring brought clarity. Thaddeus spent April and May studying his damaged cabin with the focus of a man who had found purpose in grief. He documented everything: the rotted chinking, the soft, moisture-damaged logs, the mold growth patterns. He began reading everything he could find about heat and cold, borrowing books from a trader passing through, studying principles he barely understood but recognized as truth. Heat moved through materials by conduction. Ice conducted heat 60 times faster than snow. Wet wood conducted heat 4 to 5 times faster than dry wood. These were facts, measurable and real. The conclusion was inescapable. Direct snow contact created ice. Ice created thermal bridging, and thermal bridging pulled heat from the cabin while simultaneously creating the cold surfaces that caused interior condensation. The solution formed slowly in his mind, counterintuitive and strange. Do not bank snow against the walls. Instead, keep it away. Maintain a gap, an air space between the snow and the cabin. Air was a poor conductor of heat. Still air, trapped and stable, would insulate far better than ice-covered logs ever could. The snow would still block wind, but it would not touch the walls, would not melt, would not create the destructive cycle that had killed Prudence. He sketched plans on paper, working through the details. The cabin would need to be rebuilt properly, better log fitting to minimize gaps, superior chinking that could stay dry, a raised foundation to allow air circulation beneath the floor, and most importantly, a system for maintaining the gap through winter, a trench that would need to be cleared after every snowfall, kept open despite the labor required. In June, he began purchasing supplies. Glass for real windows, expensive but necessary because oiled paper grew mold in damp conditions. Iron brackets for reinforcing the door and corners. Quality tools, including a flat-blade shovel with a metal edge designed specifically for cutting through packed snow. The other settlers noticed his spending and wondered at it. Leander Polk asked him directly what he was building. A better cabin, Thaddeus said, one that stays dry. The rebuild took all summer. Thaddeus worked alone, methodical and precise. He built a stone foundation that raised the cabin floor 8 inches above ground. He selected logs with obsessive care, rejecting any with significant taper or rot. He fitted them tighter than standard construction required, shaping contact surfaces until gaps were minimal. He developed a chinking mixture using clay, pine resin, and cattail fiber that he boiled into a compound stronger and more water-resistant than traditional moss and mud. By September, the new cabin stood complete. 2 real glass windows, a reinforced door, walls fitted so tightly that daylight barely showed between logs. It had cost him most of his savings and an entire summer of labor. Neighbors came to see it and admitted it was fine work, but questioned why a man living alone needed such a structure. Thaddeus did not explain about the gap system he planned to maintain. He simply prepared for winter and waited for the snow to come. The first snow fell on October 9, 1852. light flurries that dusted the valley and melted by afternoon, but enough to signal what was coming. Within a week, 3 inches covered the ground, and the settlers began their winter preparations. Firewood was stacked, meat was smoked and stored, and snow was packed against cabin walls. Just as it had always been done, Thaddeus did something different. He took his flat-blade shovel and began digging a trench around his cabin. 2 feet from the foundation, he cut down through the snow to bare earth, creating a clean vertical wall. The trench ran the entire perimeter of the structure, approximately 70 feet in total length. It took him most of a day to complete, and when he finished, a clear gap existed between the banked snow and his cabin walls. Leander Polk was the first to comment. He rode past on his way to check trap lines and stopped to watch Thaddeus working. "What in God's name are you doing?" he asked. Thaddeus explained about the air gap, about preventing ice formation and moisture infiltration, about keeping the logs dry to maintain their insulating properties. Leander listened with an expression that moved from confusion to disbelief to something approaching pity. "You are inviting the cold right under your floor," he said. "You will freeze by Christmas." He rode on, shaking his head. Silas Whitmore came by 2 days later, curious about what Leander had described. He walked around the cabin, examining the gap, trying to understand the logic. Thaddeus explained again, talking about thermal conductivity and moisture condensation, about how wet logs lost their ability to hold heat. Silas was polite but skeptical. "Seems like a lot of work for something that might make you colder," he said. But he wished Thaddeus well and left without mockery. Ezekiel Gage was less kind. He arrived with Barnabas. Colton in mid-November after another snowfall, having heard from others about Thaddeus's strange behavior. The gap had to be cleared again after each snow, and Thaddeus had spent the morning digging out fresh accumulation. Ezekiel stood watching, his face hard with disapproval. "This is foolishness," he said flatly. "You are working yourself to death, and for what? To prove you know better than every man who has survived a winter before you? Snow against the walls is how it is done because it works. Your wife died, and I am sorry for that, but grief has broken your thinking. You need to accept how things are." Thaddeus stopped digging and looked at the old man. "Prudence died because the cabin was full of mold and dampness," he said quietly. "The snow banking created that. I will not live that way again." Ezekiel spat in the snow and walked away. Barnabas followed, glancing back once with an expression Thaddeus could not read. By December, the entire valley knew about Thaddeus Mercer's gap, and they thought he had lost his mind. December brought temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The valley became a landscape of white and gray, the creek frozen solid, smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still, bitter air. Every cabin burned wood constantly, fires roaring day and night to keep the interior spaces barely warm enough for survival. Thaddeus maintained his gap with the discipline of religious ritual. After every snowfall, he took his shovel and cleared the trench, cutting down to bare earth, keeping the air space open between snow and cabin wall. Some days this took an hour. After heavy storms, it took half a day. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His back ached constantly, but he did not stop. The mockery had evolved from confused questioning to open ridicule. When Leander Polk saw him working in -10-degree cold, clearing snow that most men would be packing against their walls for warmth, he called out from his doorway, "Still digging your grave, Mercer?" Thaddeus did not respond. He finished his work and went inside. But inside was where the proof lived. His cabin stayed warm in a way that seemed impossible, given how little firewood he burned. He would light a fire in the evening, feed it through the night, and let it die to coals by morning. The interior temperature would drop, but only to the low 60s. The walls stayed dry. No condensation formed, no water dripped, no mold grew. He woke each morning in a space that felt lived in and healthy, rather than damp and oppressive. He began paying attention to his neighbors' struggles. Leander burned through firewood at twice the rate Thaddeus did, keeping his fire roaring hot, and still his cabin barely reached 55 degrees. The walls inside Leander's place were wet to the touch, dark with moisture. Temperance's cough had gotten worse, the same deep rattle Prudence had developed. At Barnabas Colton's cabin, ice had formed on the interior, walls in the corners farthest from the fireplace. Actual ice inside the living space, because the exterior walls were so cold from the ice pressed against them outside that moisture froze before it could even run down to the floor. Barnabas joked about it grimly, calling those corners the cold storage, but Thaddeus saw the worry in his eyes. Silas Whitmore stopped by in late December, ostensibly to borrow some salt, but really to see for himself if the rumors were true. "Is it really warm in here?" he asked at the door. Thaddeus Buos invited him inside. Silas stood in the center of the single room looking around with visible surprise. The fire was modest, barely more than a few logs burning steadily. But the cabin was comfortably warm, the air dry, the walls showing no sign of moisture. "How?" Silas asked simply. Thaddeus walked him outside and showed him the gap, explained again about dry logs and air insulation, and prevented ice formation. Silas touched the exterior cabin wall, then walked to his own cabin, visible across the clearing, and touched his own wall, feeling the difference between dry wood and ice-covered timber. He did not say anything more, but his expression had changed from skepticism to thoughtfulness. January of 1853 brought cold that felt personal in its cruelty. Temperatures fell to -20 and held there for a week, then dropped further to -30 during a clear, windless stretch that made the stars seem close enough to touch. The valley became a place where breath froze in beards, where exposed skin damaged in minutes, where simply surviving required constant effort and vigilance. Thaddeus cleared his trench every morning regardless of temperature. The work had become automatic, a part of his daily rhythm as essential as eating or sleeping. His neighbors watched from their windows, unwilling to step outside unless absolutely necessary, and they shook their heads at the lunatic who worked himself frozen to maintain a gap that made no sense to anyone but himself. The social isolation was complete now. People stopped visiting. When Thaddeus went to the trading post that Ezekiel Gage ran from his cabin, conversations would stop as he entered. He would conduct his business and leave, feeling the weight of their judgment, but no longer caring enough to explain himself. He had tried to share what he had learned and been rejected. Now he simply lived with the consequences of being right in a community that believed he was wrong. Leander Polk was the most vocal critic. He told anyone who would listen that Thaddeus Mercer was working himself to death for nothing, that the man's grief had broken something essential in his mind, that come spring they would likely find him frozen in his foolish trench. "The gap is like a tunnel for cold air to crawl right under his floor," Leander said at the trading post one afternoon. He might as well leave his door standing open, at least that would save him the labor of digging. But the reality inside Thaddeus's cabin told a different story. While his neighbors burned entire cords of wood each week trying desperately to stay warm, Thaddeus burned perhaps a third of that amount. His fire at night was modest, sometimes just coals and a few split logs, yet he woke in reasonable comfort. The cabin held its heat in a way that seemed to defy the physics everyone else understood. The walls remained dry, the air breathable, the space livable without the constant, desperate stoking of flames. Barnabas Colton came by one evening in late January, not to borrow anything or check on Thaddeus, but simply because he was curious enough to overcome his embarrassment. He sat by Thaddeus's small fire and admitted he did not understand how this cabin stayed warm. Thaddeus explained once more patiently about dry wood versus wet wood, about air gaps and thermal bridging, about how ice conducted heat away from a structure faster than any wind could. Barnabas listened carefully this time, watching the small fire, feeling the comfortable warmth of the space. When he left, he said only that he would think on what he had heard. The deep cold held through the end of January. And while the valley struggled and suffered, burning through winter supplies of firewood at unsustainable rates, one cabin remained warm and dry, the cabin everyone mocked. February brought weather that turned the mockery to silence. A cold front settled over the valley with temperatures that fell to -35 and stayed there for 12 consecutive days. At -40 on the 13th night, metal became brittle enough to snap, leather froze solid, and breathing outside felt like inhaling broken glass. This was cold that killed livestock in their shelters and turned poorly built cabins into traps that offered barely more protection than standing in open wind. Every family in the valley fought for survival. Fires burned day and night, consuming firewood at rates that made men do desperate mathematics about whether their supply would last until spring. Leander Polk burned through half a cord in 3 days. His cabin, despite the roaring fire that made the stones of his fireplace too hot to touch, never got warmer than 50 degrees. Ice formed on the interior walls a foot thick in the corners. Temperance stayed in bed under every blanket they owned, coughing constantly, her breath visible even inside the cabin. At Barnabas Colton's place, the situation was worse. An ice dam had formed where the banked snow met his foundation, and meltwater from the warmth escaping through his cabin walls had refrozen into a solid mass that was now pushing against the bottom logs with enough force to shift them. He could see daylight through new gaps that had opened between logs as the structure distorted under the ice pressure. Cold air poured through those gaps no matter how much he tried to plug them with rags and mud. His cabin was failing, literally being torn apart by the ice he had packed against it for protection. Silas Whitmore made his firewood last by letting his cabin drop to 45 degrees and wearing every piece of clothing he owned indoors. He burned green wood because he had run out of seasoned timber, and the result was a smoky, inefficient fire that made his eyes water and his throat raw, but provided just enough heat to prevent freezing. Ezekiel Gage, the oldest settler, the man who had insisted that snowbanking was the only proper method, broke down and asked his neighbors for firewood 3 days into the deep cold. He had miscalculated his supply and was burning through it faster than he had ever experienced. Men shared what they could spare, but everyone was rationing now, wondering if they would make it to March. Thaddeus cleared his gap every morning as always. The work in -40 cold was brutal, limited to 15-minute sessions before he had to return inside to warm his hands and feet. But he maintained the trench, kept the airspace open, and his cabin remained the warmest structure in the valley. He burned 4 logs a day. His fire was small, almost delicate compared to the roaring blazes his neighbors maintained. Yet his cabin stayed at 68 degrees. The walls were dry, the air was clear. He wore a single layer of clothing indoors and slept under 2 blankets instead of 5. At night, he could see through his window the desperate glow of Leander's cabin across the clearing, smoke pouring from the chimney, and he knew his neighbor was burning everything he could find to stay alive. The 14th day of the cold snap brought a brief thaw that proved more destructive than the freeze. Temperature rose to 20 degrees, warm enough for the massive ice formations at cabin foundations to begin releasing water. At Barnabas Colton's cabin, the ice dam that had been pushing against his foundation logs for weeks suddenly released a flood of meltwater that poured under his door and through the gaps the ice pressure had created between logs. Within an hour, the interior floor was covered in 2 inches of freezing water. Barnabas tried to bail it out, but more kept coming as the ice continued melting. His supplies, stored on the floor along the walls, were soaked, flour ruined, salted meat contaminated, bedding drenched. When the temperature dropped again that night, the water inside his cabin froze solid, and he was left standing on a sheet of ice in a structure that no longer provided any meaningful shelter. He appeared at Thaddeus's door just after dawn, carrying what little he had managed to save. His face was gray with exhaustion and cold. "I cannot stay there," he said simply. Thaddeus brought him inside without a word. Barnabas stood in the center of the warm, dry cabin and looked around as if seeing something impossible. "How is it so warm in here?" he asked. "Your fire is barely burning." Thaddeus added a log to the coals and explained once more, but this time he walked Barnabas outside to show him the physical evidence. They stood in the trench Thaddeus had cleared that morning. "Look at your cabin," Thaddeus said. Barnabas looked across the clearing at his own structure. Thick sheets of ice covered the lower half of every wall where snow had been packed against the logs. Icicles hung from the eaves, some as thick as a man's leg. The entire foundation was encased in ice that gleamed in the morning sun. "Now look at mine," Thaddeus said. Barnabas turned and examined the cabin he was standing next to. The logs were clean, dry, showing no ice formation at all. A light frost, perhaps, but nothing like the glacial buildup on his own cabin. The air gap between the snow wall and Thaddeus's foundation was clear, open, maintained. Thaddeus touched his own cabin wall, then walked Barnabas back to touch the ice-covered wall of Barnabas's cabin. "Feel the difference," he said. "One is wood, the other is ice. Ice conducts heat 60 times faster than snow. Your cabin has been wrapped in ice for 2 months, pulling every bit of warmth out through the walls. The wet logs inside lost their ability to insulate. Your fire was heating ice, not your living space." Barnabas stood silent, his hand on the frozen wall of his ruined cabin. He understood now completely and irrevocably the method everyone trusted, the wisdom passed down and never questioned, was killing them slowly. And the man they had mocked had been right all along. "Can you teach me to build it properly?" Barnabas asked quietly. Thaddeus nodded. "When spring comes—" Spring of 1853 brought change that had nothing to do with weather. Barnabas rebuilt his cabin in April with Thaddeus working beside him, teaching every detail of the construction that made the gap system work. Raised foundation for air circulation, tight log fitting to minimize moisture penetration, superior chinking that stayed flexible and waterproof. By May, Barnabas had a structure that would keep him alive through the next winter. Silas Whitmore came by in June and asked the same question. Thaddeus helped him rebuild as well. By autumn of 1853, 3 cabins in the valley used the gap method. When the first snows came in October, 3 men took their shovels and carved trenches around their foundations, while their neighbors watched with expressions that had shifted from mockery to uncertainty. That winter was milder than the previous one, but mild was relative in mountain country. Temperatures still dropped below zero regularly, and snow still accumulated in depths that buried fence posts. The 3 gap system cabins stayed warm and dry with half the firewood their neighbors consumed. Men noticed, women noticed. Temperance Polk, still coughing from the previous winter's mold exposure, mentioned to Leander that perhaps there was something to what Thaddeus had figured out. Leander Polk was the last to change, stubborn in the way proud men often are when facing evidence that contradicts their certainty. He maintained his traditional snow banking through the winter of 1853 and 54, and he burned through his firewood supply by mid-February. He had to borrow from Silas to make it to March, and the borrowing hurt his pride more than he admitted. The following summer he rebuilt his cabin. He did not ask Thaddeus for help, too embarrassed by the years of mockery he had contributed, but he copied what he saw in the other gap system structures. When October came, he dug his trench without comment. By 1855, 8 of the 11 families in the valley used the gap method. The technique had spread through demonstration rather than persuasion, through simple observation of who stayed warm and who struggled. Travelers passing through the valley noticed the unusual trenches around cabins and asked about them. Some adopted the practice and carried it to other settlements. The method moved organically, quietly, without fanfare or attribution. Thaddeus Mercer lived in his cabin for another 26 years. He never remarried. He worked his trap lines, kept his small garden, and maintained his gap through every winter with the same methodical discipline he had shown from the beginning. He became a quiet fixture in the valley, respected but solitary, known as the man who had figured out how to stay warm. He died in 1879, 61 years old, and was buried on the hillside next to Prudence. His grave marker listed his name and dates, nothing more. But across Montana and Wyoming territories, cabins with maintained snow gaps stood warm through brutal winters, proof that one man's refusal to accept suffering as inevitable had changed how people survived. The gap Thaddeus carved was more than a trench in snow. It was the distance between accepted wisdom and actual truth.